Previously on Games Over Coffee. Some games have been made into movies. Is that a sign of respect?
What, video game movies? Like what?
Like Sonic the Hedgehog. What about the 3D games do you not enjoy?
The 2D game design that they use in the 3D environment doesn't really translate that well. My issue with 3D Sonic games begins with Sega's addiction to speed. Last thing I remember, I was in a car wreck.
Hello, Devon.
Wait, what is this? Where am I?
For the last several weeks, you've been trying to convince your little robot friend that Sonic Adventure has bad design.
Are you a Sega executive?
Surely you'd give Sonic Generations a pass.
I haven't actually played much of that game.
Sonic Colors?
No.
Sonic Forces?
Look, dude, I'm sorry that I haven't been interested in Sonic games.
I think you should give those games a try.
Oh god.
Congratulations on becoming a new executive for Sega.
What?
As an introduction to Sonic and his history, you've been selected to experience the evolution of Sonic. In this program, you'll be given special access to Sonic's 3D platforming games. For the next 81 hours, you'll enjoy Sonic Adventure, Sonic Adventure 2, Sonic Heroes, Sonic the Hedgehog, Sonic Unleashed, Sonic Colors, Sonic Generations, Sonic Lost World, and Sonic Forces.
Okay, when will this come off?
A camera and microphone have been provided to capture your moments of enjoyment. These clips may be accessed at a later time to reinvigorate your excitement in our brand.
Okay, how do I get out of here? What is this?
If at any time you feel the need to exit, simply state the password included on your executive ID.
What? Exit.
Please state password to exit.
Please?
Sorry, plus is incorrect.
Sonic.
Sorry, Sonic is incorrect.
No, exit.
Please state password to exit.
Speed.
Sorry, speed is incorrect.
No. There is no way I'm playing all of these games. Hello? Yeah. This is happening. You know, I never owned a Super Nintendo, but it's because I wanted a Sega Genesis. Because look.
This is what it's going to feel like. Sonic Spinball.
That stuff drove me crazy as a kid. You know, that marketing worked really well on me. In those days, I played a lot of Sonic the Hedgehog. However, as I grew up, I started caring more about three-dimensional games because games were getting more advanced. And Sonic had his own 3D games, but, well, the games that he had were like Sonic Adventure and Sonic Adventure 2. And while I did play those games and had some fun with them, they never really connected with me. Not as much as like, Super Mario 64 or GoldenEye. And weirdly enough, most game reviewers would also feel disconnected with these new kind of 3D Sonic, because every time that a Sonic game would come out, a new 3D Sonic, reviewers would always give it a lower score. There never seemed to be a Sonic game that was in 3D that everyone generally loved, like Super Mario 64 or Metal Gear Solid, or even Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4. Sonic just seemed to not do very well in the 3D space. It seemed like there was always a new Sonic game coming out in 3D, and every time it did, it'd always get a low score. Reviewers would always say the same thing about the game, that Sonic needs to connect back to its roots. And I feel like that was often said because Sonic never really did anything different in the 3D space. I don't know, he never really evolved from 2D. It was like he went from 2D to 3D and that was it. I mean, the franchise never really had any exciting developments until recently. December 9th, 2021, there was an announcement for a new Sonic game called Sonic Frontiers. And Sonic Frontiers was different because it was doing something with its game design that these other previous Sonic games in the last 20 years haven't done. And that's embracing this open world aesthetic. Now, this is a new and fresh take for Sonic, and I think it's really interesting that they're doing something with it. But what I want to know is why those other games for the last 20 years have missed the mark. Why is it that it's taken this long for Sonic to make some sort of significant statement in 3D? Was there something specific in all of these games that made them uninteresting? Was it Sonic himself? Was it the production behind them? Well, because I never got to play these 3D games, I didn't really know for the longest time, but I just did play them. I just played all of the 3D Sonic platforming games from the last 20 years. And yes, I do think that I found something that connects all these games together that I do believe is the culprit for Sonic being mediocre, and I think it's his main attribute. Speed. But not just speed. Basically what speed does to control. From Sonic Adventure to Sonic Forces, all of these games have the idea of speed, and they increase in the idea of speed, but they decrease in the feeling of speed. This is the evolution of Sonic.
Watch out! You're gonna crash! Ah!
Back when I played the classic Sonic games on the Sega Genesis, those games were known as platformers, and that genre gets its name from Donkey Kong, the arcade game, where the player would literally use platforms to ascend. And all platformers are all about movement. For example, in Donkey Kong, when you're trying to save Pauline, the damsel in distress, when you go up the platforms, you're facing two different kinds of conflicts. There's the barrels, and there's the fire. You run away from the fire, and you hop over the barrels. Both things are testing the player's ability to move within the space. And when that genre became 3D, we got 3D platforming games, games like Banjo-Kazooie, Super Mario Odyssey, or Psychonauts, to name a few, and those games are also all about movement. You have a lot more control than in other games, and it's because the game itself is challenging you on controlling your character. For example, in Banjo-Kazooie, there is a lot of collectibles in that game that are placed in hard-to-reach areas, and it's your job to use your platforming abilities to reach those areas in order to get the collectibles. But when it comes to 3D Sonic, these games don't feel like platformers. They have platforming in them, sure, but when I'm playing 2D Sonic versus 3D Sonic, they feel miles apart. They're almost their own genre entirely. A genre that I want to call an on-rails platformer. Now that descriptor is a bit tongue-in-cheek because on-rails means you can't control the movement, much like you're riding a train, but you can control Sonic, so why does it feel then like I'm barely controlling him? Well, there's one person that might have the answer, and it's the director and game designer of many of the 3D Sonic games. His name is Takashi Iizuka. When asked about why Sonic plays the way he does in 3 dimensions, Mr. Iizuka had this to say. People first think of Sonic as speed, but Sonic is first and foremost an action platformer. We can't have a game focusing solely on speed, as it would be a racing game, but we can't have a game without speed, as that would not be Sonic. So mixing these two elements together, which typically don't mix well together, are the elements required in a Sonic game. So Sonic has to be fast, and he has to be an action platformer. And that's a problem in 3D, because those things don't mix in the 3D world.
Let's just see you take him! Huh.
In fact, when Sonic was first put into the 3D world, he moved a lot slower He actually played a little bit more like the classic games. It was in a game that was made for Sega Saturn called Sonic Jam that acted as a little 3D hub world. Sonic Jam was a collection of older Genesis games that was made for the Sega Saturn. Playing Sonic in this little hub world feels a lot slower than today's Sonic, but that's kind of the point, because this little hub world basically acts as a menu, except instead of selections that you have in a list, they're all different kinds of doors that you can go through. So the idea is to guide Sonic throughout these platforms, hop across stuff, and go throughout this little tiny world, discovering different doors that you can walk through. And it wouldn't make sense to make Sonic really, really fast for something like that. If you want to see what something like that would look like, you can check out this mod by Keiz Emanuar for Super Mario 64. That's what it would look like, which is insane, right? So this is what the Sonic team foresaw when they were making Sonic Adventure.
You are completely surrounded!
So because Sonic can't platform in a 3D open world while going really fast, then the Sonic team decided to put all of these challenges in front of Sonic in a straight line, which is a great way to solve the issue because now you don't have to worry about flying off any kind of platforms, you can just go straight. However, you don't really focus on jumping and you don't really focus on precision, which makes the game limit your interaction. Having challenges in front of you means you no longer need to turn, which now makes it feel like you have too much control over Sonic, because you can make Sonic go in any direction that you want to, but the only direction that matters is forward. In other words, the game is designed to constrain your movement. Because of this feeling of constraint, all the challenges that are involved feel very limiting. I don't feel like I have much of a choice when I'm running. In other words, it feels like I'm on rails. In the older games, you fully utilized all of Sonic's movement, but now you're not. So because of that, it feels like you have less control over Sonic, even though you quite literally have more control than you ever did before. This sense of speed conflicting with Sonic's platforming would be the bane of Sonic's existence, and from Sonic Adventure to Sonic Forces, every single game of this franchise feels like it somehow suffers from that conflict.
I can kill two birds with one stone!
When Takashi Iizuka, the director of Sonic Adventure, was looking to make Sonic Adventure 2, he wanted something more for Sonic to do than just constantly run. So the team ended up making what he refers to as a kind of tempo. What he meant was these varied mechanics that the player can do within the level. So instead of just running all the time, Sonic can also grind, he can bounce, he can do tricks off of ramps, he can roll on the ground, and he can use his homing attack to attack enemies, and all of these together create a kind of tempo. And that doesn't sound bad. In fact, varied gameplay is very good. However, context matters. Now, in order to understand this context, we need to look at two things: tempo and ranking. Now, the way tempo is used in games is usually in a very literal way in rhythm games, and tempo has a very specific purpose. It's used to keep the player on beat as the player plays throughout the game. One of my personal favorites is Runner. In Runner, the player doesn't actually move. The character moves on their own. All the player can do is block, slide, jump. And the challenge is to use those three things while following the beat of the music. Since all of its focus is on matching the beat, I don't need to worry about anything but focusing on the tempo and matching my mechanics. And Sonic Adventure 2 also has a kind of rhythm, only it's not music that you listen to, it's more of a kind of feeling. And the reason why it feels this way is because they're mixing tempo with this new kind of system called ranking. When I played this game at home, I played it a lot. Mostly because of the Chow Garden, but also because those first few levels were really entertaining, but not just because they were entertaining, but because I wanted to beat the ranks that were involved. So the way the rank works is like this. You run throughout a level, reach your goal, and depending on how many points you got throughout the level, you're given a letter grade from E to A being the best. So the higher the score, the better the grade. And the score was based on two categories. The first category are bonuses. You can get points by collecting rings, collecting chaos drives, destroying enemies, breaking boxes, doing flips, grinding, all kinds of stuff. But they don't give you that many points. Now the second category is speed. If you complete the level in under 1 minute, you get 10,000 points. And for every second that you go over a minute, you lose 20 points. Now I know that seems kind of complicated, but this is the basic takeaway.
I found you! faker!
With speed being the most amount of points that you can get within a level, time is clearly prioritized, which makes sense because it's Sonic, right? So it's all about speed. Because the player is trying to beat each level as fast as possible and trying to go along with these tempo-like movements, they create a kind of rhythmless rhythm game. A game that's clearly set out paths for the player to go through and do everything as perfectly as they can. Enemies are placed in a row so the player can attack them one by one. Items are laid out in the middle of the air, which motivates the player to do a flip when they launch off ramps in order to grab the item. Most of the level design is about chaining together travel methods, for example, short spaces between rails, which imply that the player should grind on one rail, hop, and then grind on the next one to retain their momentum. Ramps that lead to lines of rings, small holes that lead to rising zip lines, boost pads that lead to rockets, etc., etc. If you ever miss one of these very specifically placed things, then you halt. Your interaction just stops almost completely. Because each of Sonic's moves, his bounce, his light dash, his homing attack, all of it is based on moving forward. So if you stop moving forward, then it doesn't feel like you're playing the game anymore. It feels like you hit pause on a rhythm game. This feels really, really strange because now it feels even more like an on-rails platforming game. If you look back at the 2D Sonic games, it doesn't feel like you ever stopped playing the game just because Sonic stopped at one point. Sonic would stop all the time in that game, but you still felt like you had control over the whole thing, and it's because each of his moves don't rely on moving forward. They're just moves that you have that you can use at any time. And yeah, most of the time you're running right in that game, but a lot of times you're either going up or down also. This feeling of constantly moving forward means that the player plays the game as if it's one long chain of events that requires perfect execution. In other words, a rhythm game. Any challenge that's provided to the player is testing the player on their skill of continuity. The fact that there's even shortcuts in this game proves that point. It's trying to convey speed and therefore limits the amount of control that the player has in all three dimensions. Now I want to take a second and say that these mechanics are not inherently bad. They're just creating a feeling that's not 3D platforming. It's on-rails platforming. And if Sonic ever wanted to be more like Mario in this 3D world, he'd have to focus more on the environment.
Long time no see!
The thing was, there's this kind of annoying aspect about Sonic Adventure and Sonic Adventure 2, and that's the other characters. The other characters were added because of the way Yuji Naka, the producer for Sonic Adventure, imagined the game's maps. When he was developing the maps for Sonic Adventure, he made the maps huge so that Sonic could run through them. They were so big, in fact, that the Sonic team had to request more RAM to be included in the Dreamcast just so they could fit on the system. So after the team made these huge maps, Naka played through them and was disappointed because the player would just run right through all these maps. I mean, he wants people to see what they made and explore everything. So instead of slowing Sonic down, he just made other characters. He made these other characters to explore the same types of maps, but at a slower pace. These other characters included E102 Gamma, Big, Amy, Tails, and Knuckles. And most reviewers disliked this inclusion of Sonic's friends because, well, Sonic, who's the main character, ended up only being in 1/6 of the game. However, including these other characters did actually open up the gameplay because it was more inclusive of the 3D environment, so the player got to fly around as Tails and got to climb walls as Knuckles, something they couldn't do with just Sonic. And in a weird way, these characters actually made Sonic Adventure a 3D platformer, because, for example, you're playing as Knuckles, you use the 3D environment to look for buried treasure. You're using your movement to discover. Even playing as Tails in Sonic Adventure 2, Tails uses his mech suit to hop onto platforms to get better advantaged areas to take out enemies. They're both using playstyles that include the 3D environment as part of the goal. So in a weird way, it makes sense that Iizuka would follow in these footsteps when making the next game, Sonic Heroes. This game would allow the player to fly like Tails, climb like Knuckles, and run like Sonic, but instead of having all of these attributes in one character, the developers literally stuck Tails, Knuckles, and Sonic all together as one, and the player plays as all three at the same time. Now again, before I get into this is not a bad thing. It's just the design of this thing that makes it bad.
Talk about being stubborn and full of surprises.
The levels in this game are very corridor-like. They're the same types of levels that we had in Sonic Adventure 1 and 2. But those levels were made specifically for Sonic, so it feels kind of weird to play as Tails and Knuckles, two characters whose gameplay styles don't really match this level design. The game ends up feeling kind of diluted because of Sonic, weirdly enough, because if you just played as Tails and Knuckles, then the whole game would probably be more open, more 3D friendly. You wouldn't have these weird corridor-like levels. You wouldn't have just running in a single straight line for a long time. But because it does have that, playing as Tails and Knuckles feels like an afterthought, like you're breaking the flow of the game. The game feels like it's about Sonic, but Tails and Knuckles are just kind of forced into there. It breaks up the gameplay in a way that does not feel cohesive. It feels kind of like the same tempo-based rhythm that we had in Sonic Adventure 2, but it's much more contrived.
If it wasn't for us, you wouldn't have had a chance.
It also doesn't help that the game design is very heavily hinted. The game has these little monitors that float above every single space that you have to switch characters. It's as if the game designers don't trust the player to think by themselves. The characters themselves even say out loud when they're supposed to be switched.
Knuckles, we're counting on you. Knuckles, we're counting on you.
Knuckles, can you open the stone door for us?
Let Sonic take care of this. Best left to Tails. Let's head up there.
Let's go up there.
Let's head up there.
Shaw!
The game might as well just make the decision for you at that point. It's no fun at all to just follow instructions while playing a game. Most platforming games are about skill, and this game doesn't really allow the player to fully grasp their tools and use them in the way they want to. To make this point more clear, look at this game called Sonic 2 Heroes. It's a ROM hack from Sonic 2 made by Flamewing. It's the same exact game as Sonic 2, but you get to play as all three characters at the same time. And because you're not required to switch at any specific moment, the mechanic feels like it's a natural extension of your gameplay, like a jump or a speed dash. You can just use it whenever you want. Switching characters feels like a decision you're making for whatever reason you choose. It doesn't feel like you're required to do it. And because all of the levels in Sonic 2 are designed implicitly, they're not specifically telling you when to use each mechanic. They're letting you figure it out. Sonic Heroes feels as if they think the player is stupid, because they keep telling the player what to do over and over and over and over. It never feels like I'm the one who's in charge of my gameplay, and thus I'm not in control. Okay, I'm sorry, wait, I have to talk about this stupid part.
Gotcha, my darling Sonic.
Amy!
Not only do you play as 3 different characters at the same time, but you have a selection of 4 different teams. Each team has 3 characters, meaning there's actually 12 different characters to play as. And one of these teams is Team Rose, by far one of the weirdest design decisions that I've seen in a AAA game. Team Rose was made specifically for people who have never played a Sonic game before. So as soon as they boot it up, they're supposed to start with this team. Okay, so besides the fact that it doesn't say anywhere that you're supposed to start out with this team, besides the fact that they're the last team on the roster to choose from, besides the fact that anyone who wants to play a Sonic game would want to play as Sonic, the way that this team introduces the player to the game is so patronizing.
Listen to me carefully, and you will learn a lot. Okay, are you ready to start? First, I'll explain the formations. Each formation is different depending on who the blue symbol is the
The things that are taught to the player very explicitly through dialogue could literally just be taught to them by not saying anything, by just giving the player this intro level and letting them experiment. And I don't feel like that's asking too much, because a person who experiments with this kind of game knows how to hold one of these controllers, and if you've seen a controller from this generation, they look pretty daunting, especially to someone who's never played a game before. So someone who's going to pick up one of these controllers that has 8 face buttons, 2 analog sticks, and triggers are going to be able to experiment on their own. You don't need this much hand-holding. And you know what's weirder about that is that later on in the game, you have a serious lack of signposting, meaning you can confuse the player very easily. It's a mixture of both too much direction and not enough direction, and it's just the weirdest thing, and I hate this game. I don't like this game at all. Anyway, this game feels very on rails because it forces the player to switch characters at very specific times and doesn't allow them to express themselves mechanically. I'll admit that this game does feel a little bit better to control than the other entries because the levels are pretty big, like really big, like take 9 minutes to complete, but it still has that on-rails feeling and therefore doesn't feel like a 3D platformer.
Not that irritating hedgehog again!
So, okay, Control is more than just 3D platforming. There's also the idea of identity and how the player attaches themselves to the game. And Sonic is, if nothing else, an icon, so it makes sense that in 2004, Yuji Naka wanted to make Sonic even more of an icon. He wanted to expand the audience for Sonic even more, and he thought the best way to do this would be to emulate the way blockbuster movies do it with superheroes. So Sonic was redefined, and he became a kind of superhero in the next game, the game called Sonic the Hedgehog. But of course, you might know it as Sonic 06.
This looks worse than like the background of a Super Smash Bros. Melee stage.
And the way you play as Sonic the superhero is a little weird. Typically in video games, there's a trope called the silent protagonist, and it's when the protagonist just doesn't speak. And the reason why this happens is because it allows the player to experience the actions of the game in a more direct level. For example, Link from The Legend of Zelda has not spoken since his debut in 1986. And when asked if Link would ever speak, Shigeru Miyamoto said, "I think having the protagonist speak alienates the player. They're speaking as if the character is an extension of themselves, so why is their avatar suddenly speaking of its own accord?" The point of this design allows the player to feel as if they're the ones conquering the challenges and not watching someone else do it. While you're playing Pac-Man, it's not Pac-Man that gets the high score. When you're playing Tetris, it's not the Tetris blocks that get all the points. It's you. The character that you play as is an avatar, just a stand-in. It's an image that represents you, the player. But Sonic thinks about this a little differently. In Sonic 06, there's this part where a whale crashes into a pier, and Sonic automatically jumps onto a floating piece of wood in slow motion, and then he yells, "Jump!" And when I played that part, I thought, what? What's he saying? Why is he saying that? And it wasn't until I died that I realized he was talking to me. Sonic was telling me to jump. So Sonic's aware that he's being controlled by someone else. So most games will break the fourth wall to give information to the player. Games need to convey information that way. But usually it's in some sort of specified form, either as a joke or in like a prompt or a sign or something. However, Sonic himself will just address the player while you're playing the game. He'll say things like, "Let's head into the volcano!" It gives the player the feeling that Sonic knows he's being controlled by an outside force. There's two separate entities here. Now, that isn't an issue by itself, but when you break the fourth wall and acknowledge the player, and then don't talk about it for a very long time, it gives the impression that the player just isn't important.
Gotta be careful not to fall off here. Whoa!
Sonic, wait! I can't run that fast.
This idea of control in games is hard to just talk about because you have to actually feel the game, you have to play it yourself. It can be very easily misunderstood. So for example, if you were a big corporation who's trying to make a new video game and you think of something like, why don't we make a Superman game? Who wouldn't want to be Superman for a little bit? That sounds like a great game, let's make that. You might create an experience that looks like Superman, but feels more like a paper airplane. And superheroes specifically are a big culprit for this kind of translational error, but when a game gets it right, it feels amazing. This is one reason why Batman Arkham Asylum was such a big hit, because playing that game makes you feel like Batman. You find the combat easy, you outsmart enemies, you use darkness to your advantage. The gameplay makes you take on the attributes of Batman. Simply seeing a superhero do superhero stuff doesn't make it an interesting experience to play. You have to harness that power, you have to feel it. And Sonic 06 does not understand this fundamental part. It feels like the player isn't given the powers of Sonic, but is rather given permission to guide Sonic. Like, Sonic is already badass and he's just gonna do what he does, but you can come along too if you want to. And there's one mechanic in this game that makes that separation between the player and Sonic very clear, and that's the speed up mechanic.
Let's speed up!
From the outside, this looks really interesting because it's fun to see Sonic running at Mach speeds, but the player can't just see Sonic do it, they have to feel it. Sonic is running automatically in this mechanic, which in itself is a bad thing. You should be the one running, not him. All the player can do is jump and steer. You cannot slow him down. The places in which Sonic is running are very narrow, which means that if you jump during the wrong time, Sonic will just launch off the area. What's so strange about this is that it doesn't really feel like you're controlling Sonic because you're not really, almost at all. And the challenges are only challenging because you can't control him. In other words, this game is treating Sonic's speed as if it's the enemy. It's up to you, the player, to help Sonic so that he doesn't kill himself. If in Batman Arkham Asylum, it feels like you actually have the powers of Batman, this is the opposite of that. This feels like Sonic has powers that you're not allowed to touch. It gives the impression that Sonic's crazy speed is just too fast for you to handle. Like, imagine if Batman just beat people up on his own, that you weren't allowed to do it. Or imagine if you played Spider-Man and he just web slings on his own. This speed-up mechanic, along with Sonic's acknowledgement that he's being controlled by someone else, makes this huge separation between the player and the hero. And it makes it feel as if you're witnessing a story, and you just get to take the reins every now and then.
Yeah, this is the real me.
Because Sonic 06 was such a failure, the next Sonic game would stick to the route that Sonic Adventure 1 and 2 made, and thus Sonic Adventure 3 started production. And it was developed around the idea of Sonic traveling the world. The game was later renamed to Sonic World Adventure, but then the developers wanted to expand Sonic's fan base even more. So instead of going that superhero route, the developers decided to introduce newcomers to Sonic in an entirely different way. 3D brawling. They imagined people who didn't like to play Sonic might like a different type of gameplay, maybe gameplay that made other games popular at the time. What they created was a hybrid, a game that was half 3D Sonic and half 3D brawler. In the US, the game Sonic World Adventure would be renamed to Sonic Unleashed, a game where Sonic would race around the world during the day and turn into what they called a werehog at night. Sonic Unleashed is when the franchise began to understand what it was trying to achieve from the very beginning of its 3D transition. In this game, it actually feels like you get to control Sonic's speed, and weirdly enough, I would say that this is actually the best feeling 3D Sonic game. By this point, the developers fully understood what their on-rails platformer was all about, so they focused entirely on speed, and this modified the gameplay so that the player was focused only on moving forward and rarely, if ever, did any kind of platforming. Sonic's moveset is more about facing oncoming obstacles, so he moves a little bit more like a race car. He has things like drifting, like a boost, and moving side to side. This is also when the franchise started including two-dimensional areas, or areas where 3D Sonic would play kinda like 2D Sonic. It's as if the developers just kind of gave up on doing a 3D platformer, so they just decided to separate it into two games, 3D and platforming.
Well, this is new.
The racing parts of this game feel the absolute best when compared to other 3D Sonic platformers, at least to me. And I think it feels that way because their focus is not on platforming. The mechanics feel a lot more fluid. I actually feel like I understand where Sonic is going and how I'm controlling him, or at least I feel more in control. At least as much as I can on this kind of on-rails feel. It feels better than the other games is what I'm saying. And I think this feeling can be attributed to a mechanic, namely the boost mechanic. The boost mechanic is where you press and hold a button in order to make Sonic go turbo fast. And now it finally feels like we get to harness Sonic's power for once. This is like so much better than what it was in Sonic 06, where it felt like we couldn't touch his speed. Now we actually have it in our hands. So now the game has completely left the idea of 3D platforming. I mean, Sonic can still move around in 3D, but the level design and the art style suggests so heavily that you should be moving forward that it feels almost unnatural to turn. It feels much like you're on a racetrack. The pathways that Sonic takes throughout these cities, they're all very narrow. They lack any space that's open enough for Sonic to move around in, like in Sonic 06. The areas mainly consist of flat areas with slight variations of height, and it makes the player want to continue going straight, which is perfect for what they were trying to achieve. And this is a turning point for the franchise. Sonic now knows what it is and what it isn't. Sonic is about moving forward and chaining together little combos to maintain momentum.
Sonic, inside you're the same as ever. I guarantee it.
However, it should be noted that this is not a 3D platformer anymore. This is exactly what the Sonic team had been working toward, whether they knew it or not. It's just Sonic moving through a 3D space, and this is proof that that idea can work. However, it's not platforming. Because Sonic Unleashed had these moments of 2D gameplay, it's clear that the developers were trying to separate the idea of platforming and 3D Sonic, so now there are two different ideas that coexist. But that's not to say that this separation of ideas is entirely bad. Just because a game has weak design doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad game, it just has weak design. You can have a lot of fun with a game despite its design. Everyone has different tastes. You know, just because a Sonic game doesn't have a 3D platforming element in it doesn't mean it can't be fun. Case in point,
Let's go to an amusement park or something.
I remember when Sonic Colors was released for the Nintendo Wii in 2010, but I didn't pay any attention to it because I just thought it was another Sonic game. But boy was I wrong, because this was by far the most fun I've ever had with any 3D Sonic game. And despite the game not being a 3D platformer, the game is actually designed around a different element, the on-rails aspect. So let's step back for a moment. In Sonic Adventure 1, the parts that stuck with me, the parts that I found the most entertaining, were usually the parts that didn't have any platforming in them. Because as we've said many times now, that kind of platforming is very limiting. So the parts that stuck with me the most were usually the times that I didn't have to focus on the precision so much about Sonic's speed. For example, the snowboarding level in Sonic Adventure 1, or the street boarding level in Sonic Adventure 2 were by far the most entertaining levels for me, because I didn't have to focus on any weirdo linear platforming. I just had to focus on making Sonic go fast and jump off of ramps whenever I felt like it. It was fun, it was expressive, it felt almost like a skateboarding game. Now let's look at Sonic Colors again. The kind of challenges that are in this game aren't the same kinds as they had before. They're not super challenging, because as we've seen in previous games, failing those challenges will halt your momentum. So to keep up your momentum in here, it's less about overcoming barriers and it's more about timing your button presses correctly so that you create longer chains of speed. And if you ever fail, then there's usually a safety net of some sort so you can continue going forward. What's a little weird here is that this mechanic of this on-rails continuous movement is the same thing that we had in Sonic Adventure 2, which is why I didn't like that game so much. But the difference here is that Sonic Adventure 2 was more about platforming, whereas this game is more about the on-rails feeling. So the game's combos, the tricks, and the score, they're all the foundation of what make up the game as a whole, whereas it felt like an add-on for Sonic Adventure 2. For example, the grinding rails in Sonic Adventure 2 are just kind of there, they're kind of tiny and they're around the level, whereas in Sonic Colors, they're gigantic and they're a huge part of the level. The enemies in Sonic Adventure 2 felt like they were lined up in little groups, whereas in Sonic Colors, they're lined up in huge forms that are parallel to where you're going. This is what cohesive design is. It's about designing the game around the feeling that you want to achieve, and it's very obvious that Sonic Colors is trying to achieve the feeling of momentum. But with every good idea, there are drawbacks.
That was almost difficult.
The 3D parts of Sonic Colors feel really good because you're not overcoming arbitrary challenges. But because the game doesn't have these challenges, it doesn't feel challenging. It can be very fun to play, but it takes not a whole lot of skill, which is totally fine to do. I mean, it's one of the reasons why it was exclusively made for Nintendo Wii, because they were trying to target younger audiences. But with that smaller difficulty curve in the 3D parts, most of the skill seems to be reserved for the 2D sections. And there's a lot of 2D sections in this game. It really does feel like the developers decided to separate completely the idea of 3D and platforming, that they could not mix at all. This meant that the 3D parts are for like a good racing time, but they don't incorporate what Mr. Iizuka said was the very foundation of a Sonic game, the action platforming. Like I said before, this separation of ideas is not terrible. It's fine, but it doesn't solve Sonic's 3D platforming problem, because now what we have is a 2D platformer and a 3D Sonic, and they're two separate games that coexist.
Something sucked all the life and color out of it.
This was kind of a strange move for Sega because they were catering to Sonic fans, something that they're not known for doing. So when this game was released, there was a lot of positive discourse around it because Sonic seemed to be fun again. And this game was definitely that. It was having a whole lot of fun with Sonic. But sometimes fun is not enough. Okay, so games are usually supposed to be fun. Like if a game isn't fun, usually people won't play it. But focusing on fun does something different to the game design. For example, let's look at Super Mario Odyssey. This game is basically an evolution of the 3D platforming Mario games, and it's the same thing where Mario goes around solving riddles and trying to collect moons and stuff with his fun platforming play. In Super Mario Odyssey, there's a level called New Donk City, and in that city there's a part where there's a festival that happens. In this level, it's all about a celebration of Mario. And this whole level is basically just a bunch of nostalgia. It's just you going through the level and kind of having a celebration. People are just dancing around, you're collecting coins. There's a lot of not real challenges here. It's just a lot of fun to go through this level and just kind of experience a fun nostalgia break. So what happens, say, if you were to take that kind of level design and make it into an entire game? Sonic Generations. Sonic Generations follows suit with Sonic Colors with the type of 3D gameplay that it has, meaning it's not that challenging. So when you put Sonic into an area that's mainly meant for show and tell, and he's controlling in a way that doesn't require a whole lot of skill, then it doesn't really feel like you have that much control over him. You get an even greater feeling of on-rails gameplay. The game feels fine to play, but most of the game is just holding down a direction and watching on screen as Sonic does a bunch of cool stuff. Sure, there's plenty of fan service going on. I mean, I loved seeing the 3D renditions of Green Hill Zone or going back to revisit City Escape with a new type of gun truck. That was a blast. But that was it. I mean, I didn't re-immerse myself in a world. I wasn't in a story, not one that matters anyway. I wasn't really doing anything. I just felt like I was running through levels. Kind of like how Yuji Naka didn't want people to feel when he made the levels for Sonic Adventure 1. The game is fun, and if that's all you want in a game, then that's great, that's fantastic. But I feel like it was a bit shallow, and I wanted something a little bit more fulfilling. Games are about interaction more than anything else, and this game didn't really feel so interactive as much as it felt like a movie with a control stick. The two-dimensional parts in this game are more skill-heavy, not a ton more, but more, and the 3D parts feel like they just completely abandoned the idea of platforming altogether. It seems to me that the 3D parts of this game are set on this cinematic quality that these games have been dripping with ever since Sonic Adventure 1. With a 3D Sonic not really being challenging anymore, it feels like the design has been capped. Like, the game just is set in being cinematic, and if this is what Sonic is best at, then where do you take the game design from here?
I built a TV out of paper clips.
Yeah.
3D Sonic at this point could have gone in any direction, and I actually skipped over a bunch of different kinds of Sonic games, like the story series for Wii that included Sonic and the Secret Rings or Sonic and the Black Knight, or the game adaptation of the TV adaptation called Sonic Boom. But the point here is to explore Sonic as a 3D platformer, and in many ways this next Sonic game is the most 3D platforming Sonic that I've played, although I think it's technically a spin-off, but I still want to talk about it. The game is called Sonic Lost World, and it's a game that I wasn't really aware of until now. I know it came out on the Nintendo Wii U and then was later ported to PC for some reason. A lot of reviewers would say that this game was a ripoff of Mario Galaxy, but maybe inspired is the right word, because this game was intentionally made for Mario lovers. It was made for the Nintendo system, exclusively for the Nintendo system, and it was made to have a more open 3D feel. And you know what? I think it works. I mean, Sonic actually controls, I think, really well in this space. He even has a run button, like Mario. That's crazy. But the game still doesn't stick the landing, and it's because, again, of Sonic's speed, and mainly what Sonic's speed does to level design. Again, because Sonic is supposed to be this speedy character, a lot of the levels that we have are very elongated, which ends up forcing Sonic into one single path. Even though we have this super crazy Mario Galaxy-esque center of gravity ball thing that's happening, we're still making corridor levels and constraining the movement all over again. But that's not the weirdest part, because these types of levels can work, like we saw in Sonic Unleashed. They just have to be designed for more of a tube-like atmosphere, like this level that is a tube, or this level that is a honeycomb where Sonic can run on the outside. They're not 3D platforming, but they work. They're still fun. No, the level design issues come up when Sonic is 3D platforming. And this is kind of astonishing to me because the developers behind this game, I feel like, are talented people. They probably have years and years of experience, but the levels that they've made feel like they've been made from someone who's never made a 3D platformer before. And I don't know, maybe they haven't. When a beginner thinks from 2D to 3D, it's a really weird thing to do because they take this and put it into 3D, which is now this. And obviously that doesn't work because the player has a lot more space now. So a beginner might just simply elongate that centerpiece to encompass all of the space. However, they're not really utilizing the 3D space, they're just elongating a 2D space. The challenges are exactly the same. For example, going up the stairs this way is the same thing as going up the stairs this way, or that way, or literally any way. Every way is the same, and therefore this isn't really making use of a 3D environment, not in a meaningful way anyway. This is a 3D version of a 2D environment. If you want to fill the environment meaningfully, you have to think about the 3D space and what it means to traverse the area. Perhaps that means isolating challenges so that the player has to specifically go to each one. And Sonic Lost World creates 3D versions of 2D challenges. It's like this is the first time we ever get to, actually 3D platform as Sonic, and yet what we're doing is a 2D challenge, just a 3D version of it. Now, this isn't always the case because there are some levels that actually make use of the environment, like this little level where you gotta roll a fruit around the planet, or this little area where you have to destroy enemies around the planet. But those are more just little pieces of a much bigger game because the rest of the game is more just running in these weird corridor areas, which is not even necessary because Sonic doesn't even run that fast here. And we're not even talking about half of the game, which is yet another 2D section. And listen, despite this weird design, I like to see this kind of experimental stuff done in a Sonic game. I mean, this is the first time that I've seen him in an actual 3D platformer that feels pretty good. In fact, this game was even miniaturized for the 3DS, which has depth perception. You can see depth in that game, and that's something that all of the 3D Sonic games have all needed, so it was really, really cool to play him in that game. However, the level design just really screwed it up, didn't make it matter almost at all. The point here is that that kind of experimentation gave us a fresh take on Sonic. It's something that I felt like was desperately needed in this franchise. I could not take any more of that corridor gameplay. I just couldn't do it anymore. I mean, it capped in Sonic Generations. I don't feel like there's anywhere else to go. You can't evolve corridor gameplay anymore from there. But it did.
If we're going to win, we have to do it without them.
And thus we've come to what Sonic is today. It's the most on-rails feeling gameplay I've ever played in Sonic. It doesn't even feel like I have a controller anymore. To understand how we got to this point, we have to understand what Sonic was from the very beginning. In 1988, Yuji Naka went to an amusement machine show. He saw an arcade game that did something that he had never seen before, a player that was running on slopes. And Naka, who was working for Sega at the time, asked if he could port that game to the Genesis. So Naka played around with these slopes a little bit, but he didn't like the idea of how slow the character was moving. He was moving at 2 dots per 60th of a second. So Naka increased that to 16 dots, 8 times faster. But this was problematic when the game was being made into a platformer, because the player can't judge precision when traveling that fast. So any times that Sonic was meant to run really fast in the classic Sonic games, he only did so in areas that had no opposition. No enemies, no platforms, no gaps, just Sonic running through twists and turns or some sort of interesting looking thing. And all the player had to do was hold forward and watch Sonic do all the fun stuff. And this kept happening in 3D as well. Sonic Adventure has this part where they tell you just before you start the level. It might be confusing controlling Sonic in certain areas, you just have to hold the direction you want to go. And that idea, the idea that the character only goes fastest when the player stops controlling them directly, is the idea that's propagated throughout this entire franchise. I can tell you that Sonic Forces is definitely a very fast game. It's like an action-packed Michael Bay movie, but anytime that I want to slow down, look somewhere, turn, go backwards, or literally do anything, I feel like I'm going against what the game wants me to do. This is the opposite of a 3D platformer. This only lets the player fully control Sonic in tiny bits. Whereas Sonic began as a mostly player-controlled game with cinematic bits and pieces, this feels like a cinematic with player-controlled bits and pieces. This is everything that Sonic's design has built up to, and it has terrible scores. If this is what Sonic was always meant to be, and it still doesn't score well with audiences, where do they take the game design from here? How do they embrace a 3D platforming feel that has always eluded them? So I've been marinating on this question for a while. It seems to me that the developers of Sonic have never really understood what it means to control Sonic. What does it mean from the player's perspective to control Sonic? What kind of experience does the player have? Speed has been the only thing on their mind when creating a Sonic game, because apparently that's what creates a Sonic game. But when I thought about speed, I thought about two games in particular. The first one is Sonic the Hedgehog 2006. Sonic seems very fast in that game. However, he doesn't feel fast. I never wanted to be fast in Sonic 06. In fact, I wanted it to be slower. I just happened to control a character that just happened to be really fast. If I'm supposed to want to be fast, then it has to be a part of my craving. It has to be a part of my desire. Have you ever played a racing game and been stuck with a slow car and you look at the really fast cars and you're like, I want to be those ones? That's what we need in a Sonic game. That super fast character that we look at and we're like, I want to be that one. This occurred to me while I was playing this second game that came to mind. Crazy Taxi. Crazy Taxi is a taxi service game made for the Sega Dreamcast where you're timed on getting to your destinations. And funny enough, I wished I were Sonic in that game. Like, I want to go as fast as I possibly can in this 3D world. The only way to make it more Sonic would be to add verticality into the mix. But that game already exists. That's Spider-Man. Spider-Man feels like it's all about speed. And, speed has nothing to do with Peter Parker. It's all in the player's mind. And that's what we need in a Sonic game. And I don't know, call it Sonic's chili dog delivery. Speeding in the game should be expressive. Give the player so much control over Sonic that it feels like they're showing off when they're going really fast, like in speed runs. That's it. Exit.
Please state password to exit.
Power.
Sorry, power is incorrect.
No, it's gotta be power. There's nothing else that makes sense.
I'm afraid you've missed the point.
What?
Do you really think it's taken Sega 30 years to understand the design of Sonic?
Oh. One of the reasons why Sonic 06 was such a failure was because of its production. Yuji Naka left the development team in the middle of production. Sega restructured the development team so that they could work on different games at the same time, and that left them with a very fractured, very small team for Sonic 06. Sonic Heroes was developed in 20 months, just under 2 years. Takashi Iizuka said it was the most stressful time in his life. Sonic X-treme was the first 3D Sonic game for the Sega Saturn that ended up being cancelled, that went through several iterations, so many that the development team, a lot of them worked until they literally got sick. Every Sonic game that's been released has been in some way a statement of Sega's brand. Back in 2010, before Sonic Colors came out, they spent a lot of time pulling games that had bad reviews away from the market, so that they could preserve the quality of Sonic's brand. In the end, making a Sonic game is a business decision. He's not trying to improve his games, he's trying to stay relevant. So what's the password? Sales?
Sorry, sales is incorrect.
Money?
Sorry, money is incorrect.
I don't get it. 5 letters? 5 letters. 5 letters.
Oh, hey there. Looks like you're awake.
How long have I been here? Where's Joe?
Joe, I'm sorry, who is Joe?
Joe. Well, my robot, where's...
The doll, right. He's over there. Well, Devon, thankfully, it looks like you've gotten off lucky. No real serious injuries. We got the typical scrapes and abrasions you might expect in a car accident.
Hey, Joe. Hey, Joe.
Right. So, seems like you're still a little out of it. So, maybe I'll just come back later.
The footage that you saw was... Joe, I'm in the middle of a video. Oh, where'd everyone go? No, it hasn't. How are you doing that?
Devon, can you hear me?
I'm afraid you've missed the point.
Hey, Joe.
For more game design videos, visit gamesover.coffee. Joe and I are best friends.